So we're back, and let's see if your intuition and understanding was right. So again, we're talking about growth rates and in OECD countries. Now, one way to look at this is we know, if you're a member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that you're relatively wealthy in the present, whereas many of the members of the OECD were not members or were not wealthy in 1960. So our model and the base of it, if I think about this, I think it probably, shouldn't it look like if we have a higher real GDP per capita, holding everything else constant, we're going to have higher levels of capital, which means we're going to have diminishing returns to capital. So for each unit of capital we add, if we're wealthier, we're going to get a smaller return than the countries that are poor. And by extension, we're also going to have a smaller gap between our investment and our depreciation rates. We're going to have a smaller gap between our depreciation and investment levels. So we're going to be adding a smaller amount of capital, and that capital is going to yield a smaller growth rate. So what this would tell us is that if you were richer in 1960, you should have seen a lower growth rate between 60 and 2000. And if you were poorer in 1960, you would have seen a higher growth rate. So let's see if that is borne out in the data. Of course, before we get there, we could point out that this would, if we know that all of the OECD countries are wealthy by 2000, we know all of the countries ended up in the same place. And so another way of phrasing this question is a much less interesting form of the question, which is, given that we started off at different places at the same time and ended up in the same location at the same time, did we converge? And the obvious answer is, well, yes. Duh. Another way of looking at this, however, a more charitable way, is holding institutions relatively constant. Does our model explain growth at this point? So assuming away everything else, in other words, holding a lot of things constant, which is why we're talking about the OECD. Of course, we're excluding Germany and Turkey here, sort of outliers. Does this fit? Well, hopefully you're thinking right now, and that you've got down on a sheet of paper, that this should look like, see if I'm right here, but I think this should look like a demand schedule. It should slope down and to the right. And boy, howdy does it. Yep, of course we've got Luxembourg as an outlier there, and we've got Ireland a little bit higher growth rate despite, right? But the fitted line definitely looks like a demand schedule, and so it does look like this. So, once we hold institutions constant, we get convergence. But it turns out that in the larger data about the world, we don't get convergence. Yes, China has grown relatively quickly and is slowing down now. But there are many poor places around the world that have seen very low rates of growth for the last 100 or 200 years. Certainly the last 50 years. Some of them have even seen negative growth. So we should not forget to zoom back out and realize that the decision to invest is driven by incentives. Now, people may be saving, but the question is, do they turn that into investment? And that's a whole nother question. So let's revisit our assumptions, because we know that neither capital on its own nor savings rates are going to be able to get us to what we see in the historical record. So, constant savings rate, constant amount of labor, constant human capital, constant technical knowledge. We can now cross out savings constant because we've relaxed that. We've seen what happens when we change the savings rate. So now let's take a look at what happens when we change human capital or we change labor. And it turns out that changing the amount of human capital has the same effect as changing physical capital, but it tapers off even more rapidly. And the reason for that is that if you think that physical capital has a high depreciation rate, physical capital has an even higher depreciation rate. Now, why would I say that? Well, at the limit, eventually we're all going to die, and so the rate of depreciation on human capital overall is in aggregate 100%. But on a daily basis, what do you think degrades faster, a physical machine or our understanding of how to work machines? I know that on the ranch, we still had tractors from the 1920s and 30s. My grandfather was no longer around for some of the time. The depreciation in his human capital was much higher than the depreciation rate on the John Deere or the Farmall tractor that we had. But even short of death, if you think about the skills that you learned. So when I learned programming initially, and I'm not much of a programmer, but when I first started out programming, I learned programming in BASIC. Now, if I wanted to work in BASIC, that's not a very useful skill anymore. Now we're into C# or we're into HTML or we're into a whole bunch of other things. So it turns out that we have a depreciation rate. We could actually augment our model, and if any of you take intermediate macro with me in the fall, we will augment our model to make this richer and have what we would call a human capital augmented model. But it turns out that changing human capital on its own can't get us to what we see in the historical record, because we have exactly the same issue that we do with physical capital, only it's more extreme. There are diminishing returns to investing in human capital, and human capital depreciates rapidly. So human capital can't get us there. How about labor? Well, it turns out labor will have absolutely no impact. We can again augment this model to look at the per capita level, per worker amount of physical capital, and we could look at the per worker amount of output, in other words, the per capita GDP. Adding more units of labor while holding everything else constant will increase GDP, but it will have no impact on GDP per capita. So say that holding all else constant, the average and all workers, let's assume all workers are the same. Right now, every worker is producing 5 units of capital and we have 100 workers. So our GDP per capita is going to be, our GDP is going to be 500, but our GDP per capita is going to be 5. Now let's add another 100 workers and they each produce 5 units of capital. So now our overall level of GDP is going to be 1,000 units of output. However, we have 200 workers now, and so the per capita GDP is going to be 5, just like before. Now, it turns out that I would argue that we care about per capita output. We don't care about output. So again, I would much rather live in the United Kingdom, which has a much larger per capita GDP than China, but has a much lower GDP than China. So I would argue that what we care about as social scientists and what we care about as human beings is per capita output. So adding L, or labor, and increasing output isn't going to change per capita output, obviously, unless something else changes. What this means is that capital investment, human capital, and labor may be relevant for explaining catch-up and imitation growth. And our model can do a fairly decent job of explaining those. But these 4 things cannot explain growth over longer periods of time. They also can't explain cutting-edge innovation growth. We're going to need another way to explain that. However, our model at least now has ruled out those other things. So you can think of this like a diagnostic framework. It's useful to rule out what it isn't. Just like when you go to the doctor, if you have a stomach ache and they push here on your belly and they say, does it hurt here? And you say, nope. And they push over here and they say, does it hurt? Nope. Does it, right? Why are they doing that? They're not doing that to waste your time. They're doing that because they're able to rule things out and thus narrow down what it is. That's exactly what we're doing here. So we've ruled out savings being an issue. We've ruled out labor being an issue. We've ruled out human capital none of these can get us there. And machines on their own also can't get us there. So let's try the next piece. The next piece, we're going to augment our model. So let's go back to our general form. So Y is a function of capital and output. Capital and technology or technical knowledge. And if we get more specific, the book is going to throw this up here. Now the 1/2 again doesn't need to be 1/2, and in the real world isn't. to match our underlying assumptions about the world, it just needs to be between 0 and 1. And now we have technical knowledge entering in a multiplicative fashion here. What is this saying? Well, by putting it in here in a multiplicative fashion, what we are inherently doing is saying that technical knowledge, ideas, make all units of capital more productive. And I think this is entirely plausible. So once somebody figured out the idea of leverage, it made every stick far more useful. Once you knew that you needed a fulcrum and a lever and you could move the world, then it made all of the sticks more productive. And that's true of a lot of things, right? You think about the idea of just-in-time manufacturing, although now I'm probably dumping a fair portion of the organization's piece in through A. That's actually what we're generally going to do. But the idea here would be that scientific knowledge or ideas make all machines more productive. Now, what will that do? Well, what will that do in this picture? If we now go from A equals 1 to A equals 2, what's going to happen here? So take a moment and see if you could draw up what you think would happen if we increased A from 1 to 2. And I'll stop it here and we can come back, and hopefully you will have committed yourself to something, and then we can see if you got it right or if there's something we need to clear up.